Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon if you're tuning in from North America, and good evening to those tuning in from Israel. Welcome to the first session of The Madwoman in the Rabbi's Attic, the tale of Yalta the Shrew, which we have the pleasure of learning with Miss Gila Fine. And for those who have not had the pleasure of learning with Miss Fine, Gila Fine is a lecturer of rabbinic literature at the Pardes Institute of Jewish Studies. She is exploring the tales of the Talmud through philosophy, literary criticism, psychoanalysis, and pop culture. She is the recipient of the Maimonides Award for Excellence in Jewish Studies and serves on the faculty of the Nachshon Project, Amudim Seminary, and the Tikva Scholars Program, the London School of Jewish Studies, and the Community Scholars Program, in addition to teaching thousands of students at conferences, campuses, and communities across the Jewish world. This class is going to ask, why are shrews always so vicious? How did the ancient world view the male-female body? And what possessed Yalta to smash 400 bottles of her husband's wine? The comic tale of Yalta, read through the Bible and Talmud, Aeschylus and Aristotle, Arabian Nights and Canterbury Tales, William Shakespeare and William Congreve, Charles Dickens and Charlotte Brontë. And with that, I want to hand things over to Miss Fine for what looks to be a good hour of learning.
Thank you very much, Kayla. Hello, Drisha. This is so exciting for me. I have been hearing such great things about Drisha for so long and genuinely actually wanting to teach for it. And I'm really excited that this is happening for me now. It is very lovely to see some familiar faces. It is even more lovely to see people I don't yet know and look forward to getting to know. And so, okay, a word about the course. The Madwoman in the Rabbi's Attic is a course based on a book that I recently published. And like the book, it serves essentially as an introduction to Agadah, or rabbinic storytelling. We will learn a bit about what Agadah is, what distinguishes rabbinic storytelling from other types of stories, the history of rabbinic stories, how they were created, how they were read throughout Jewish history, and ultimately we will learn how to read and unpack these stories on our own. So you'll be able to, hopefully by the end of this course, go home and do this on your own. Basically, we'll acquire the textual techniques, the literary skills, the historical background that will empower you to make sense of these stories outside of this course. And with that, let us begin. I want to begin today, before actually turning to practice, we have to begin with a little bit of theory. We have to learn a little bit about the textual, the literary, and the historical background of Agadah. We will be devoting most of today's session to that. And then hopefully by next week, we'll actually put the theory into practice and we will work on a piece of Agadah together. And so I want to begin actually by trying to define the genre. And I want to ask you, what do we mean when we say Agadah? That is not a rhetorical. I actually do expect answers to that question. Again, stories. Thank you, Susanna. Stories, that is absolutely correct. Agadah, on the most literal level, is the Aramaic word for a story or a tale. It is the Aramaic equivalent of the Hebrew Haggadah, which is what we do on Pesach, because on Pesach we tell a story. That is one answer, but I'm going to be a Talmudist about it, and I'm going to complicate the answer.
In the meantime, I just want to point out from chat, from Rena Fisher, who mentions Agadah
This is halacha. Very good. Thank you, Kayla. And absolutely correct, Rena. And we will get to that in a moment. I think Sue is going to be typing what. Oh, there she is.
Okay. It finally worked. No, I was going to say that as opposed to halachic material, it's Agadic material.
Absolutely correct. Very good. We'll talk about that distinction, which is absolutely central. Robert is making a point that these stories always make a point, which is absolutely correct. And we will talk about that too. You guys are great. All right. So let's complicate this basic definition of Agadah as story. Very early on in the Talmud, we have a rabbinic statement that tells us that God lays tefillin every day. Now, this is traditionally considered to be Agadah, but it's not a story. Not in the technical sense of the term of having a beginning, a middle, and an end. And so we have to kind of refine this definition a little bit. And I want to begin by looking at the rabbinic attempts, the attempts of the rabbis themselves to define Agadah. At this point, I'm going to share my source sheet. All right, so we're going to begin at the beginning with number 1. And would you read the first source in number 1 for us, please?
Appoint for yourself a teacher, a vote. How? He must appoint a permanent rabbi and learn from him Bible, Mishnah, Midrash, Halachot, and Agadot.
Thank you. What can you tell me about Agadah, or Agadot as is mentioned here in the plural, from this rabbinic statement? Okay, good. Oh, very good. So it comes last in the series, said Yael, which Laura then concludes that means it's last in importance. You're absolutely right. We have a catalog here. We have a list. And I guess you'd have to ask yourself if the list rises or decreases in importance. It teaches a lesson. Very good, Robert. It is, but it's including in the teachings one should learn. Very good. Okay. All right. So good. Ariel and Laura, fantastic. Let's begin with that. What we have in this list is a basic rabbinic curriculum. These are all the things that the rabbis would have learned in the Beit Midrash. But I put it to you that this list, Diana points out that it's different from Midrash. That is absolutely correct, and we'll talk about that. This list could be further divided into 2 sub-lists. Can anybody tell me what the internal division of this list is? What you're saying, Cindy, is very interesting, and we're going to talk about that. Any suggestions to how we might divide this list up into 2 groups? Written by men, written by God. That is one suggestion, in which case you'd have Midrash on the one hand and all the other works on all the other items on the other. I kind of gave that away when I said works. If you look at this list, items 1 and 2, Bible and Mishnah, they are actual works. They're actual texts. They're books. Midrash, Halachot, and Agadot are not. What are they? They're not, strictly speaking, compilations. Well, so I'm getting a lot of answers pertaining to the orality. The Mishnah is also an oral text. When the Mishnah was published, it was published as an oral text. Sandra, yes.
Could it be that they are gloss? If we're contrasting the texts 1 and 2 to written, and could it be that these are not just that they're oral, but that they're glosses on the text?
So you're getting very close, Sandra. Bible and Mishnah are texts. Midrash, Halachot, and Agadot are genres. They are types of discourse, which means at this point that we know that Agadah is a genre, that it is somehow distinguished both from Halacha and from Midrash. Let's read on, please, Laura, to the second source, and we're going to try and refine that definition.
And Moses told words which draw one's heart like a narrative.
Thank you. What can you tell me about Agadah from this definition? Emotional import, says Susanna. Absolutely correct. So the rabbis here are creating a pun between the root yaged or lehagid, which means to tell or a tale, and nagad, which means to draw. The words of a tale draw your heart, meaning stories are emotionally compelling. They are persuasive in a way that expository prose is not. This basically is the Freudian theory of art. Freud, centuries later, will tell us that stories are extremely compelling because they bypass our rational faculties and they go directly to the emotions, which is why teaching a lesson via a story is always going to be a lot more effective than simply giving us the lesson directly. Let's read the next source, please, Laura.
If you wish to know the creator of the world, learn Agadah, for through this you will come to know God and cleave to his ways.
Thank you. What can you tell me about Agadah from this source? Moral relevance, a personal way to connect to God. Fantastic. It's kind of a big picture thing. It goes to the very great questions of God and religion and morality. And let's read one more, and this is my personal favorite, Laura.
The Lord spoke to you face to face, an angry face for Bible, a moderate face for Mishnah, a friendly face for Talmud, a laughing face for Agadah.
Thank you. So what the rabbi is doing here, they're giving an interpretation on the description of the Sinai revelation as the Lord spoke to you face to face. Why is the word face used twice? Well, because God reveals the different elements of the rabbinic curriculum, the different elements that we traditionally regard as Torah, with different faces. We have an angry face for Bible, a moderate face for Mishnah, a friendly face for Talmud, and a laughing face for Agadah. What do you make of this definition of Agadah as the laughing face of God? Irony, says Robert. Good. Anything else? Don't take it literally. Fantastic. Anything else? So I would say, as opposed to these other items, playful, fantastic, light, as opposed to Bible, Mishnah, and Talmud, Agadah is playful. It is whimsical. It is subversive. So all these are really lovely, rather poetic definitions. However, none of them really get us closer to a scientific working definition of the genre that is Agadah. This comes to us after the rabbinic period, in the Gaonic period, courtesy of Rav Shmuel ben Chofni Gaon. Laura, if you would read one more text for us, please. This is number 2.
Agadah is every interpretation that appears in the Talmud about any matter that is not a commandment.
Thank you. Says Rav Shmuel ben Chofni Gaon, Agadah equals not halacha, as some of you said earlier. Take all of rabbinic literature and take away all of the halacha, all of the legal conversations, everything you'll be left with by negative definition is Agadah. This is a really good definition and is the one that scholars use to this day. Rabbinic literature naturally breaks down into 2 meta-genres. Halakha, which are the legal discussions, Agadah, which is basically everything else. Under this broad negative definition, we have a whole slew of sub-genres. I love your comment, Miriam, and I'll return to it. Agadah includes, excuse me, Midrash. Midrash are the stories the rabbis told about the Bible. It includes rabbinic legend, or Ma'aseh Chachamim. These are the stories the rabbis told about themselves. It includes folk tales and philosophical discussions and epigraphs about the good life and the just society. It includes sermons and parables and jokes. In fact, Bialik, who created an entire collection of the stories of the Talmud, basically says, this is number 3, Agadah is a classic expression of the spirit of our nation. Practically all literary genres that were prevalent in Israel at the time made their way into Agadah. Whoever wishes to know the nation of Israel in all of its different dimensions, let him learn Agadah. And in fact, it is not just the multiplicity of form, of genre that defines Agadah, it is also a multiplicity of content. Agadah includes everything, across the spectrum, from lofty abstract discussions of metaphysics and ethics and theology to small, trivial, everyday stories of friendship and family and food and money and study and sex. And this for me is one of my favorite features of Agadah, or rabbinic storytelling. In Agadah, nothing is deemed too small or trivial to be included. In Agadah, everything is included because everything is meaningful, everything is significant, everything carries a lesson to be learned. And can I have another reader, please, to take us through number 4? This is a non-Jewish scholar who I think beautifully captures the essence of Agadah. Can I have another reader, please, if you'd like to volunteer to read? Ariel, thank you very much. Please unmute yourself and read number 4 for us.
Classical Judaism produced a literature which looks at first sight like someone's grandmother's attic, in which endless quantities of curious things, which might someday come in handy, have been passed down like so many balls of string lovingly collected over the years and piled on top of each other without apparent concern for distinctions between weighty and trivial matters. This apparent jumble of piety and trivia is the medium of the rabbinic message which is the effort to penetrate every corner of ordinary life with God's presence. The rabbis think nothing of making their most profound commandments with the nature of God in the midst of discussing the uses of cheese. Rosemary Radford Ruther, Judaism and Christianity, 2 4th century religions.
Thank you. And so if we look at this definition of rabbinic literature as naturally breaking down into the meta-genres of halakha and agadah, we have certain rabbinic texts which are almost exclusively halakha. These are generally the early rabbinic works of the Mishnah, the Tosefta, and the halachic midrashim. Then, although I should say even in those halachic works, we often have a smattering of narrative. If you read the Mishnah, every now and then you'll come across a very short story. And if you find a story in the Mishnah, pay attention, because if the rabbis included it, it must be extremely important. Then we have other rabbinic works that are devoted exclusively to Agadah, such as the Midrash Agadah, Bereshit Rabbah, Shmot Rabbah, Esther Rabbah, Kohelet Rabbah, or the Tanchuma, or the Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer. And perhaps most famously, we have rabbinic works which bring the two together, where we have Halakha and Agadah cheek by jowl, most famously the Talmud. Both the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud, the one we generally mean when we just say Talmud, where Agadah comprises 1/3 of the entire Talmudic text. So Agadah is central to the Talmud. It was not, however, central to Talmudic study for most of history. As we move out of the rabbinic period and into the post-rabbinic period, Agadah becomes significantly marginalized, if not entirely ignored, and it is only halakha that is studied in the Beit Midrash. Can anyone suggest a reason for this? Why, for most of Jewish history, we've ignored Agadah and focused exclusively on halakha? The rules of living, halakha is universal. Its importance wasn't recognized. Fantastic and all correct answers. Very good. So let me start with fantastic. Okay, very good. Let's start with the first one, which I think Robert and Lois both said. Halakha has immediate practical ramifications. We need to know what to do. We most especially need to know what to do if we're going to make it as a unified people with one central code of law. And so there is direct, immediate significance to studying halakha, as opposed to Agadah, which nah. Second, these stories were often deemed too small or trivial or insignificant to actually warrant any serious attention. Third, Agadah, as we mentioned, is subversive, often because the rabbis use it as a main mode of rabbinic self-critique. The rabbis use their stories to criticize themselves, and we have many, many stories in the Talmud of rabbis behaving badly. Now, this is fine as long as these are stories told by rabbis to other rabbis within the rabbinic ivory tower. But what happens when the Talmud takes over the Jewish world and everyone is studying it? Now it's embarrassing. Now we're not really sure these stories should become as public knowledge as they are. And so we kind of ignore them. We brush them away. Fourth, the move out of the rabbinic period to the post-rabbinic period coincides roughly with the historical move from antiquity to the Middle Ages. This is a shift that historians will often characterize as the shift from mythos to logos, from myth to rationality and reason. The ancients had no problems believing in mythology, in supernatural occurrences, in miracles. This was no longer considered okay in the Middle Ages, once philosophy and rationality had taken over. And so what do the medievals do with all these stories in the Talmud that feature miracles and supernatural occurrences? This too becomes a matter of deep discomfort. So how do post-rabbinic Jews, from the Gaonic period through the medieval period to the modern period, how do they deal with these sources of discomfort? Well, one way was to, as we saw, the Gaonim, they distinguish halakha from Agadah, and they invalidate the latter. One basic Gaonic maxim that we see again and again in Gaonic writings is we do not rely on Agadah. Halakha is authoritative, you have to do what it says. Agadah is not. Another way of dealing with the difficulties of Agadah, and one of you mentioned this earlier, was to read these stories as an allegory, as a parable, rather than take them at face value. This is a methodological error, I should mention, because when the rabbis want to tell us a parable, they tell us a parable. They're not shy. You know how we know it's a parable? They generally start it with, this is a parable, to what may this be compared? However, when they tell us a rabbinic legend, we are meant to take it literally. A third way, which we find often in some of the traditional commentators on the stories of the Talmud, is to provide apologetic explanations. For instance, there's one really disturbing story of one rabbi who hazes another rabbi, who makes him go through a very humiliating and cruel hazing. Rashi will come in and tell you he wasn't really hazing him. He was trying to cure him because he had an illness. That too fails to take the rabbinic storyteller at his word. But the most obvious strategy to dealing with the difficulties and the challenges of Agadah was to simply ignore it. And throughout Jewish history, Agadah was marginalized. It was overlooked in yeshiva study, and it was ignored by the majority of traditional commentators. And this is true to this day if you walk into an ultra-Orthodox yeshiva. In an ultra-Orthodox yeshiva, they will plow through a section of halakha, they will reach a story, and they will simply skip over the story or skim read through it until they reach the next halachic section. All this changes in the 19th century. I quite agree, Cindy. I think those were miserable centuries as well, and thank God we no longer live in them. In the 19th century, Agadah takes place of pride within the departments of Jewish history, within the academy, which in a way makes sense. Jewish historians wanted to know what happened in the rabbinic period. This is the classical foundational era of Judaism. And the only historical records we have of this incredibly important period are the stories in the Talmud. But there's a problem. These historical records aren't terribly historical. For one thing, there are glaring contradictions between what we find in these stories and what we know of Roman and Persian history at the time. For instance, in the famous story of the destruction of Jerusalem in Tractate Gittin, we are told that Nero was sent to destroy Jerusalem, but he had second thoughts, and so he ran away, converted to Judaism, and ends up giving birth to Rabbi Meir, which is rather different to what we know historically, where Nero basically fiddles on the roof while Rome burns down. There are also many internal contradictions between different rabbinic accounts of the very same historical incident. Again, for instance, in the story of the destruction of Jerusalem in the Talmud, Marta bat Baitos finds her death. But in the same story in the Midrash, she doesn't die, she simply loses all her money. Also, these stories emphasize moral causality rather than geopolitical causality. Again, in the story of the destruction of Jerusalem, Jerusalem is destroyed not because we have a tiny Jewish polity that thought it could wage war and win against the mighty Roman Empire. According to the story in the Talmud, Jerusalem was destroyed because of, quote, Kamsa and Bar Kamsa. There is a moral lesson the rabbis are trying to teach. And finally, the biggest tell is that these stories they have a literary artistry and a structural elegance that clearly shows that these are works of rabbinic fiction. They are not history. Now, 19th century historians knew this. They knew that these weren't historical records. However, they were so desperate to try and glean history out of these stories, they thought, let me take the story, I'll kind of do away with all the literary junk, and I will find the kernel of historical truth at the heart of the story. And then I'll take all these kernels and I'll use them to piece together a rabbinic history. The rabbinic histories that were created in this process were deeply methodologically flawed. They were a result of imposing a modern idea of history on pre-modern texts that didn't share the same notion. But this all changes again in the 20th century. In the 20th century, Agadah switches from the departments of Jewish history to the department of Jewish literature. And it is now literary scholars rather than historians who begin to read these stories, claiming that these stories are fiction. This is how they were created, and this is how they ought to be read. The rabbis never sought to record history. Rather, they used the literary devices of narrative. Remember those words which draw one's heart like a story, to impart certain moral or religious teachings. Now, the turn toward Agadah as history was revolutionary. It blew the field wide open for various reasons, but the most important one was this. If a particular rabbinic story is historical, it is a record of one thing that happened one time to one person, or maybe a small group of people. But if it is not historical, if it is fiction, if it is a story that was created, transmitted, and edited by generations and generations of rabbis, then it gives us a direct window into how these generations of rabbinic authors, editors, and transmitters actually saw the world. Can somebody please read Ariel, would you read number 6 for us, please?
Okay. Talmudic literature simply cannot be converted into historical narrative. No passage can be treated as an eyewitness account. None can be supported to tell just how things were. The question, did these things really happen, is not important. What is important is the question, what view of reality shaped the minds of the men who told these stories, lived by these laws, believed these myths? Jacob Nissener, Development of a Legend.
And so what it was discovered in the 20th century is Agadah is actually a window into rabbinic history, but not in the way that 19th century historians thought. Agadah is a historical record not of the story's characters, but of the story's creators. I'm going to give you one more piece of history and then we're going to dive into some texts. You've been real troopers by sticking with me this long. Let's talk a little bit about Agadah in the 21st century. Because after centuries of being on the sidelines of the Beit Midrash, Agadah has now risen to unprecedented heights of popularity. Today, the stories of the Talmud are some of the most beloved texts of Jewish study. You can find them being taught in traditional yeshivas and in secular universities, in synagogues and in schools, in community centers and Jewish organizations across the Jewish world. And there are several reasons for this. For one thing, these stories are literary masterpieces. I like to tell our students that this is our Shakespeare. That is if you like Shakespeare. If you don't like Shakespeare, then nothing like Shakespeare. They're quite misleading because they read like very simple folk tales, but scratch the surface and worlds of drama and conflict, of passion and emotion come bursting forwards from between the line. And so there's something really challenging, and as I'm going to try and show you, really fun about trying to break open, to unpack a piece of rabbinic storytelling. Second, these stories are extremely accessible. As opposed to halakha, the legal sections of the Talmud, which require years and years of specialized study to really be able to master, Agadah, at least on some level, can be read and understood by anyone. I say at least on some level because I'm going to make an important caveat next week, and that is what these stories seem to be saying and what they are actually saying are often diametrically opposite. And so we actually do have to learn a little bit about how to unpack these stories properly. Third, these stories are extremely relevant. Again, as opposed to halakha, which includes a lot of arcane and obsolete law that has very little bearing to our lives today in the 21st century, Agadah includes many themes that read as particularly close to home. We have stories of rabbis dealing with difficult parents and disobedient children, with insensitive spouses and treacherous friends, with financial insecurity and failing health, with ethical dilemmas and existential crises, with loneliness and with death. These stories may be hundreds of years old, but they are as existentially relevant to us today as they were to the rabbis of 7th century Babylon. And finally, and with this I will end, and we're actually going to look at some text, Agadah seems particularly compatible to the spirit of our age. Halakha is a code of law, and like any code of law, it was formulated to promote the greatest good to the greatest number. Inevitably, then, it will harm those that don't fit the mainstream. Any code of law that is written with the mainstream in mind is going to harm those who are on the fringe. And the rabbis knew this. And so alongside halakha, they give us agadah. They give us stories that critique their own halachic system, that acknowledge the limitations of that system, and that give voice to those that the system inevitably hurts. Aria, one more time, I'm going to abuse you. Could you please read number 7 for us?
One of the more interesting theories in Aggadic studies posits that the narratives of the Talmud are a critical tool through which the rabbis examine themselves and critique their halachic creation. The stories constitute reflection on the Talmudic work, hence they often diverge from the halachic ethos and even oppose it.
Thank you. And there is something about this subversiveness, remember, the laughing face of God, that is very appealing to us in the 21st century, in the postmodern era. The subversiveness, the radical nature of rabbinic stories that made them so deeply problematic for so long is precisely what makes them so popular today. And I will put it to you that we in the 21st century are the first Jews in history that are able to read these stories with the same radical spirit with which they were composed. So it's never been more exciting to be an Aggadist than today. And so with that, let us turn to actually look at a piece of rabbinic storytelling, a piece of Agadah, and see how we can make sense of it. And to demonstrate, I'd like to take us through the subject of the first chapter of my book, and that is the tale of Yalta the Shrew. So let me begin with that last word. What is a shrew? A small mammal. Very good, Susanna. What else is a shrew? A nasty woman. Good. A bitter woman. Fantastic. Anything else? Hysterical, annoying. Fantastic. Very good. All right, so let's start. A woman who doesn't listen. An uppity woman. That is a good word. So let's start with Susanna's answer, which is in fact the original answer. Shrew, in its original meaning, was a small mole-like mammal known for its aggressive nature and venomous bite. However, in the 13th century, the term expands to include this kind of nasty, uppity, contrary woman known for her aggressive temper and venomous tongue. Now, the archetype might have appeared only in the 13th century, but it is in fact a lot older. Shrews can be found throughout history and across cultures, snarling and scolding their way throughout the Western canon. And let's begin by thinking at some of the shrews we know and love. Now, if you looked at the source sheet, you can't play. Let's begin with the Bible. There's one classic example, I would say, of the shrew in the Bible. Can anyone tell me who she is? Again, no peeking at the source sheet.
Jezebel.
Jezebel, I think, has definite shrewish elements to her. I think Jezebel is more of an overreatrix, and if you want to know what that archetype is, you have to read chapter 5 of my book. Sandra, was that a hand?
Yes, I would say it has, well, you know my predilection from my books, but I would say it has to be Vashti.
It is absolutely Vashti. Clearly, you are the expert in this field. Read Sandra's book, everybody. It's fantastic. All right, so let's actually begin now. Let's look at the source sheet. Let us begin with the book of Proverbs. It is better to dwell in the wilderness than with a contentious and angry woman. Contentious and angry woman, as good a definition as any for the shrew. And then we obviously have the character of Queen Vashti, who disobeys her husband's orders to appear at the royal banquet. Moving from biblical to rabbinic literature, let's make this a bit bigger. Another thing to know about rabbinic stories will often follow a halachic discussion in the Talmud, as we said, but sometimes they'll follow another story. Very often stories in the Talmud will come to us in clusters or groups on a particular theme. And in the Talmud, in Tractate Yevamot, we have an entire story cycle devoted to the subject of shrews. Can somebody please read number 9 for us? Can we have another reader, please? If you would like to volunteer to read,
I'll
please.
read. I'm Cindy.
Thank you, Cindy. Go ahead.
Rav was constantly tormented by his wife. If he told her, prepare me lentils, she would prepare him peas. If he asked for peas, she would prepare him lentils. When his son Chia grew up, he reversed his father's requests to her. Rav said to him, your mother has improved. Chia, who wasn't really very politically correct, replied, it was I who reversed your requests to her. Rabbi Chia was constantly tormented by his wife. Nevertheless, whenever he would find anything suitable, he would wrap it up in his shawl and bring it to her. Said Rav to him, but surely he is tormenting the master. He replied, it is sufficient for us that they rear up our children and deliver us from sin. Rav Yehuda was reading his son Rav Yitzchak the verse, and I find more bitter than death the woman, from Ecclesiastes. His son asked, who, for instance? His father replied, for instance, your mother.
Thank you. Notice one of history's first ever Yo Mama jokes is right here in the Talmud. What can you tell me about the shrew from these 3 stories? Susanna, we're going to get to Yalta. Disobedient on purpose. Great. I would say disobedient and passive aggressive if you're doing it on purpose. She has a mind of her own, clearly. She is contrary. Anything else? She's married. Good. These stories are often domestic dramas. She stands in opposition. She's oppositional. Very good. Anything else? Let me ask you this. Who do we not see in these 3 stories? She does a good job of raising the kids. Good, Cindy. We'll return to that. Who do we not see in these 3 stories? The wife, the shrew, an entire shrew story cycle, not one shrew to be found. Now, this is generally true of the shrew narrative genre. Shrew stories are almost always told from the point of view of the suffering husband, which is what we have here. We have the perspective of the poor, suffering rabbis who are patiently putting up with the antics of their shrewish wives. This is generally true, and we're going to see this as we move forward. These stories are generally told from the point of view of the man. The perspective of the shrew herself is hardly ever there. In fact, it'll be really interesting to read a shrew story from the perspective of the shrew, which is precisely what we're going to do next week when we look at the story of Yalta. Let's move from rabbinic to Greco-Roman or classical literature. Again, without peeking, can anyone tell me who the great shrew of Greco-Roman literature is? Any classicists in the house? Hera, I think, has a lot of shrewish elements to her for sure. She's a bit more complicated than that because she's a goddess. But I'm thinking of, yes, Lois, Xanthippe, the wife of the famous Greek philosopher Socrates. Cindy, would you please take us through number 10? Just unmute yourself before you do. Yes.
Of
Xanthippe. Xanthippe. With a Z.
Of Xanthippe, who first scolded Socrates and later drenched him with water, he said, did I not say that Xanthippe's thunder would end in rain? When Alcibiades said that Xanthippes' scolding was intolerable, he said, I am used to it, exactly as if I were constantly hearing the clattering of pulleys, and Xanthippes provides me with children.
And the next one, please.
Alcibiades sent to Socrates a large and beautifully made cake. Xanthippe, who was rather jealous of the giver, took it out of the basket and stamped upon it. Socrates only smiled and said, Now, my dear, you will not get a slice of it any more than I.
Thank you. All right, what can you tell me about the shrew from these two narratives? She's not taken seriously. Good. Socrates really does refuse to take her seriously. There's an act that's spiteful. Fantastic. All right, let's begin with that. The shrew is spiteful. She's so spiteful, in a way she becomes self-destructive. As Socrates basically tells her, look, you've ruined the cake for both of us. You're not going to enjoy it now any more than I. And Socrates, very much like the rabbis of the Talmud, just puts up with the abuse with relative patience, explaining very much like Rav Chia had, well, she's the mother of my children, so what are you going to do? Let's move from Greco-Roman to medieval literature. Can anyone tell me about any shrews you might think of from the Middle Ages? Okay, so Lois, here's the general rule. You're absolutely right. However, no feminism is allowed at this stage of the game. We're reading the archetype straight. We're reading it as they would have read it throughout history. We have to know the thesis before we can deconstruct it. So at this point, we're not going to be too feminist about it yet. Taming of the Shrew is modern, and we're absolutely going to get there. Let's start though with some medieval shrews. One work which supplied us with more shrews per capita than perhaps any other is Arabian Nights. There are a ton of shrews in Arabian Nights, though perhaps the most notorious is Fatima, the wife of the cobbler Maruf. Cindy, would you read one more text for us, please?
There dwelt once in the city of Cairo the god-guarded cobbler, who lived by mending old shoes. His name was Maruf, and he had a wife called Fatima, whom the folk had nicknamed the Shrew, for that she was a worthless, ill-conditioned wretch, little of shame, and a sore mischief maker. She ruled her husband and used to revile him and curse him 1,000 times a day, and he feared her malice and dreaded her mischief.
Thank you. And so the story continues where Fatima demands that her husband bring her home a honey cake. Maruf goes out looking for a cake. He can't afford anything because he's not a rich man, until a baker takes pity on him and allows him to take a very, very cheap cake for free. And so Maruf comes home with this very cheap cake. Fatima sees that the cake is cheap and not the one that she wanted. She flies into a fit, she throws it in his face, and she knocks out one of his teeth. What can you tell me about the shrew from this story? Aggressive, good. Intemperate, very good. Anything else? Sandra? Demanding, controlling, fantastic. Anger, very good. Yes, Sandra, inconsiderate, fantastic. You unmute yourself, Sandra.
So sorry, I think violent and sadistic have to be added in here.
100%. So violence is a big part of the shrew narrative, both verbal and physical violence. And I'm going to connect what Cindy said and what Robert said, angry and impulsive. And I'm going to say that perhaps the main defining characteristic of the shrew is that she is mad, in the double sense of the word. The shrew as mad woman is both angry and crazy, raging and deranged. I'm going to briefly mention two more shrews. I think Robert mentioned the wife of Bath from the Canterbury Tales. The wife of Bath basically boasts, this is number 12, about the fact that she was married to 6 husbands and she made the lives of each and every one of them a misery. And another famous shrew of the Middle Ages was Noah's wife. The medievals loved putting on plays based on different biblical stories, and they were particularly fond of the story of Noah and the flood. Now, Noah's wife, who barely gets mentioned in the biblical incident, takes center stage of these plays as an absolute shrew from hell. She refuses to believe that there will be a flood. She hits, kicks, curses, sits on poor Noah until ultimately she has to be dragged kicking and screaming onto the ark. Let's move on in a little bit of time that we have left to the modern era and perhaps the most famous shrew of the entire Western canon, and that is Katerina Minola from Shakespeare's The Taming of the Shrew. Can I have a Katerina, please?
I'll read.
You were right all over that, Lois. Can I have a Petruchio, please? Come on, you guys, it's your chance to read Shakespeare. It doesn't have to be a man, it can be a woman. Thank you, Laura. Go.
Thou hast hit it. Come, sit on me.
Asses are made to bear, and so are you.
Women are made to bear, and so are you.
No such jade as you, if you mean.
Come, come, you wasp. If faith, you are too angry.
If I be waspish, best beware my sting.
Who knows not where a wasp does, where his sting, in his tail.
In his tongue.
Whose tongue?
Yours, if you talk of tails, and so farewell.
What, with my tongue in your tail? Nay, come again, good Kate. I am a gentleman.
Then I'll try.
Skyer. 100 years after Shakespeare, William Congreve coins the motto for shrews everywhere when he says, "Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned." I'm going to mention these briefly because I would like to get to the end of this in the little time that we have left. An American example, just to show you guys across the pond that shrews, in fact, did exist in the US of A. We have Dame Van Winkle, who tormented her husband so awfully, Rip Van Winkle actually has to escape into the future to get away from her. Moving back across the pond, we have Mrs. Jo Gargery from Great Expectations, who manages to torment two men for the price of one by using her brother to hit her husband. Let me ask you this, and with this perhaps we'll finish for today. What genre does the shrew narrative belong to? What are all these stories that we've read so far have in common? Think about the stories and how you responded to them.
Emotion. Emotion. That's right.
Comedic, very good. Humor, you guys are good. Yes, the shrew narrative. The shrew is a humorous character and her story is often comedic. Now, the reason for this, without going too deeply into theories of humor, is that humor generally is a product of incongruity. Bringing together two things that generally do not belong together is what produces the comedic effect. So a cat playing the piano is funny because cats generally do not play pianos. A violent woman, in this respect, is like a piano playing cat. She is incongruous, therefore she is humorous. There is something inherently comedic about a woman who hits and kicks and curses. But the final shrew that we're going to look at before we actually get to Yalta next week comes to us courtesy of a dramatic rather than comedic narrative, and that is Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. Now, if you've not read Jane Eyre and you would like to read Jane Eyre, and I highly recommend it, I'm going to ask that you mute me for the next 60 seconds or so. I will do this when we're done, but I'm about to make a huge spoiler, and I don't want to spoil the novel for you if you would like to read it. So, spoiler alert, you've been warned. Okay. The secret at the heart of Jane Eyre is that Mr. Rochester, Jane's love interest, is in fact already married, and his wife, Bertha Mason, is a madwoman locked away in the household attic. Now, this is a shrew taken to a mad and murderous extreme, as Bertha a number of times tries to kill her husband and burn the house down. And Lois, would you read number 17? And with that, we'll probably conclude our business for today. But you, yeah.
In the deep shade at the farther end of the room, a figure ran backward and forward. What it was, whether beast or human being, one could not at first sight tell. It groveled, seemingly on all fours. It snatched and growled like some strange wild animal, but it was covered with clothing and a quantity of dark, grizzled hair, wild as a mane, hit its head and face. Mr. Rochester flung me behind him. The lunatic sprang and grappled at his throat viciously and laid her teeth to his cheek. They struggled. She was a big woman in stature, almost equaling her husband, and corpulent besides. She showed virile force in the contest. More than once, she almost throttled him.
Thank you. I'm just going to quickly address Miriam's comment. Miriam, the sexuality is actually far more characteristic of the archetype of the femme fatale. And if you want to know more about that archetype, you can read chapter 2 of my book. But to talk about the shrew and to summarize our definition of the archetype, the shrew, as I said, is a mad woman in the double sense of both angry and crazy. She flies into fits and attacks those around her. She is the wife of a timid and terrorized husband, a whipped husband, who suffers through her antics and does his best to appease her temper. And she is a comedic character whose story, told from the point of view of said suffering husband, features scenes of verbal abuse or physical violence, oftentimes both. And with this definition in mind, we now proceed to the great shrew of the Talmud, Yalta. One more word about Yalta, and then I will dismiss you until next week. Yalta is the Aramaic version of which Hebrew name? Can anyone tell me? Yael, very good. Yalta is the Aramaic equivalent to the Hebrew Yael. She lives in 3rd century Babylon, and she's generally understood to have been the daughter of the Reish Galuta, the exilarch, essentially the leader of the Babylonian Jewish community, and the wife of Rav Nachman, one of the great rabbis of his generation. Yalta is mentioned no fewer than 7 times in the Talmud, making her the most commonly referenced woman in the entire Bavli. But of all of her stories, it is this story which is probably the most famous. And we're going to end by reading the story through, and then we will do a hard break, and I will leave you on that cliffhanger until we unpack the story together next week. So Lois, one last time, would you please read number 8? The story is from the Babylonian Talmud, Tractate Brachot, page 51b.
Ula was once at the house of Rav Nachman. He had a meal, said the grace after meals, and handed the cup of blessing to Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman said to him, "Master, please send the cup of blessing to Yalta." Ula responded, "So with Rabbi Yohanan, the fruit of a woman's body is blessed only from the fruit of a man's body, as it is written. He will bless the fruit of your body. It does not say the fruit of her body, but the fruit of your body." Meanwhile, Yalta heard, and she got up in a passion and went to the wine storehouse and broke 400 jars of wine. Rav Nachman said to him, "Let the master send her another cup." He sent it to her with a message, "All that wine can be counted as a blessing." She returned another, "Gossip comes from peddlers and lice from rags."
Thank you. All right, so at this point, we're out of time. We're going to read the story again at the beginning of next week. We will try and understand what it means, and then you are going to go work on it on your own, and you will try and unpack what it really means, the deeper meaning that lies hidden between the lines. So with that, I'm going to wish you a great week, a Chodesh Tov, a good new month, and I will see you next Tuesday, please God.